Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Apocryphal Gospels, a very short introduction, by Paul Foster, narrated by Jennifer Van Dyck.
Chapter 1. The Apocryphal Gospels. What's in a Name? There are also many other things which Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. John, chapter 21, verse 25. So ends the Gospel of John, with an acknowledgement that it contained only a limited number of the traditions about Jesus. But is this statement mere authorial hyperbole, or does it reflect a reality that in the Gospel writer's day there was a vast number of stories and sayings attributed to Jesus in circulation? If, even to a limited extent, the author of the fourth Gospel portrays the prevailing circumstances of his own day, it becomes fascinating to ask what happened to all these extra traditions concerning Jesus. In all likelihood, the vagaries of ancient history would mean the vast majority were lost in the mists of time. Romantic notions of such material, surviving through long chains of oral tradition, reaching down 2 millennia, are simply fanciful. For such additional traditions to survive, the only plausible mechanism would be through the medium of written texts, either copied and transmitted by scribes down through the centuries, or through the chance preservation of ancient manuscripts. Up until about the 1870s, only the first of these two alternatives was known to have led to the preservation of extra-biblical traditions concerning Jesus. Manuscripts recounting stories purporting to be events in the life of Jesus before his public ministry, or further post-crucifixion narratives, were generally the types of documents that had survived through scribal copying. Hence, the written sources tended to be medieval or early modern copies, many centuries removed from the date of composition of these extra-biblical stories. In many ways, these represented a gap-filling exercise by providing details of the so-called hidden years of Jesus' life. However, during the last quarter of the 19th century, as archaeologists commenced large-scale excavations in Egypt and scholars began trawling through dusty library collections, long-buried and long-forgotten manuscripts started to emerge. The first discovery, made in 1885, was a relatively small scrap of 6 incomplete lines of text found amongst the papyrus collection of Archduke Rainer in Vienna. Whether this text is actually part of a separate, larger, previously unknown gospel, or is simply a variant reading of part of the Gospel of Mark, is contested. Nonetheless, it was the first window on the murky world of the transmission of ancient, non-canonical Christian texts. A more substantial discovery was unearthed at an archaeological dig at Akhmim in Upper Egypt during the winter season of 1886-7 by members of a French team. A small book, or codex, was exhumed from a monk's grave, and this contained 4 texts in its 66 pages. The first, ranging over 9 pages, was identified as a fragment of the lost text, the Gospel of Peter, which had previously been known only by name, having been discussed by various early Christian writers. The rapid stream of discoveries continued through the last decade of the 19th century. In 1897, 2 young Oxford scholars, B.P. Grenfell and A.S. Hunt, commenced an archaeological dig at an Egyptian village called El Behesna, some 100 miles south of Cairo and 10 miles west of the Nile. The village name stems from the Arab period and did in fact represent the renaming of what had been a much larger city known as Oxyrhynchus. As is the case now, when Grenfell and Hunt arrived at Oxyrhynchus, little remained of that ancient settlement, apart from 1 stone column, and various rubbish heaps, each about 30 feet deep. The mixed debris of those rubbish heaps contained a vast number of papyrus fragments, basically what turned out to be the waste paper of the day. This contained a fascinating array of documents, including tax receipts, bills of sale, personal letters, and census records. Such finds were the so-called documentary papyri that provide such vivid insights into the everyday lives of people from the various social strata of that ancient society. Combined, however, with such documents were literary texts. Fragments of Homer and schoolboy exercises in copying Euripides were found, along with various Christian texts. Apart from ecclesial texts and fragments of writings contained in the Bible, new texts were discovered that purported to record the actual words of Jesus, or those of his followers. In fact, the very first text from the Oxyrhynchus Trove to be published was entitled Sayings of Our Lord, and contained both previously unattested sayings and versions of sayings that varied from the parallels in biblical texts. It would only later transpire that these fragments were part of a larger text known under the title of the Gospel of Thomas. However, what this series of early discoveries did was to open up the possibility that an alternative source of traditions about Jesus existed, and that this might offer a radically different insight into the teachings and person of Jesus. From these early discoveries, scholars collected together these disparate texts and published collections of apocryphal, or non-canonical, gospel texts. They shared in common the fact that they were not included among the biblical writings. Thus a new sub-branch of investigation into early Christianity began to emerge, the study of the apocryphal New Testament. The meaning of the term Apocryphal Gospels. The very title, Apocryphal Gospels, is a highly contested label. Taking the word gospel first, it may be thought that it is self-evident what this term means. Depending on the definition employed, the meaning of the word gospel may appear obvious. A recent writer commenting on the Gospel of Judas stated that this work does not deserve the label gospel, since, according to the author in question, it says nothing about the real Jesus. From this perspective, the definition of the term gospel appears to become little more than a shorthand way of referring to writings about Jesus that were later deemed to be orthodox. In other words, the term is narrowly and exclusively defined as referring to one of the four Gospels contained in the canonical New Testament. Such circular thinking automatically excludes from the discussion those texts which some early Christians may have considered authoritative, even of equal value alongside the four Gospels that are instantly recognizable today. These additional texts need to be taken on their own terms and judged against the historical background in which they were written, rather than being excluded on the basis of anachronistic and theologically motivated criteria. Returning to the term gospel, it is important to understand that this word had a range of meanings even before it came to be used as a term for designating written texts about Jesus. There are basically two sources of evidence which help to clarify the meaning of the Greek word group relating to gospel. The noun euangelion equals gospel, and the verb euangelizo equals to announce glad tidings, to proclaim good news. Prior to its use to designate early Christian texts that employed the term as a title. The first comes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament scriptures, known as the Septuagint. In that collection of texts, this word group refers to an oral proclamation or the announcement of some news. Often the news is a positive event. Isaiah chapter 52, verse 7. Nahum chapter 2, verse 1. However, this is not uniformly the case. In one Old Testament story, a messenger, thinking that he is bringing good news to David of King Saul's death, soon learns that David does not consider this as glad tidings. The unfortunate herald pays the ultimate price for being unable to distinguish between good and bad news. 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 10. The second source of evidence does not emerge from biblical material, but rather from the use of the term in association with the imperial cult. The Jewish historian Josephus, who skillfully advanced his own career by predicting Vespasian's rise to imperial office, wrote of the effect of the proclamation of the new emperor taking office in AD 69 at the culmination of one of the most turbulent years in Roman history. Every city kept festival for good news, euangelia, and offered sacrifices on his behalf. Jewish War 4, 618. In the so-called Priene inscription, the laudatory language that describes Augustus refers to the consequences of his ascension and reign in the following manner. It is resulting in signaling to the world through him the good news, euangelion, of the birthday of our God. Lines 40 and 41. Therefore, it is unsurprising that in the earliest stages of the Jesus movement, the term gospel denoted an oral proclamation of some event of significance, usually with positive ramifications, such as the accession of a new emperor. Christian usage of gospel language may have looked to the antecedents in the Old Testament, but would also have been attuned to the popular contemporary usage as part of the imperial cult, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, where emperor veneration appeared to flourish. If this were the case, then Paul's appropriation of gospel language was far from a politically neutral maneuver. Rather, in a subversive and controversial manner, the one who styled himself as apostle to the Gentiles intentionally took hold of the language of the imperial cult in order to claim that Christ, not Caesar, was the source of good news and the manifestation of divinity. So if the term gospel started its Christian phase as referring to oral announcements, why, how, and when did it come to be associated with written documents? Perhaps the first two aspects of the question are somewhat easier to answer, at least partially. As the numbers of first-generation followers of Jesus diminished, there was presumably a need to enshrine community tradition in order to preserve and communicate the message. It is almost certain that the content of early forms of written tradition was derived from oral proclamations known as gospel. The earliest of the canonical Gospels, that written by Mark, opens with the words, "Beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ." Mark, chapter 1, verse 1. So it appears that as early believers began to crystallize what had previously existed as an oral proclamation into a written form, the same term gospel was used to describe the content of the written message. However, the title of this literary work, either simply According to Mark or The Gospel According to Mark, was almost certainly not part of the text when it first circulated. It was therefore a striking change for a term that was used to describe oral proclamations to be applied as a description of a written work, especially given the presumably significant differences in content. So when did this relabeling first occur? Like many innovations, its originator and the specific circumstances that led to this daring use of terminology are unknown. But texts written by Christian figures in the 2nd century use the term gospel to refer to written documents as though this terminology was widely understood and was a common way to refer to the type of documents under discussion. The hard evidence for the earliest demonstrable use of the term gospel to designate a written form rather than an oral proclamation comes from two sources. First, the earliest manuscripts of the writings with titles using the term gospel date to around the year AD 200 and the decades that follow. An early copy of the papyrus manuscript of the Gospel of John, known as P66, dated at some point around the end of the 2nd century, has the title Gospel According to John. The slightly later manuscript, containing both Luke and John, P75, has a title at the end of Luke stating Gospel According to Luke, and then at the beginning of John, Gospel According to John. Thus, while there may not have been consensus, even in the same manuscript, concerning whether such titles belonged at the beginning or the end of the text, these writings were already being labeled as Gospels. The second piece of evidence is even earlier. Writing around AD 180, Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon, in his work Adversus Haeresis, Against Heresies, refers on multiple occasions to written documents using the term gospel. In Book 3 of this work, he refers to the 4 evangelists issuing Gospels in different geographical locations, although the location of Luke's Gospel is not specified, Adversus Heresis 3:1:1. Irenaeus uses the term Gospel to denote written documents unambiguously on many occasions and without explanation. The very fact that he offers no explanation leads to the supposition that he was not the innovator of this usage, and the natural way in which he uses such terminology suggests that gospel, as a designation for a written document, had been established for some time. While certain scholars have argued for such usage stemming back to the beginning of the 2nd century, such a claim cannot be established with any certainty. Rather, it appears more accurate to state simply that by the second half of the 2nd century, Christian writers could quite naturally speak of certain written documents as Gospels. The designation of those Gospels outside the fourfold collection as apocryphal is a description that originated with post-Enlightenment scholars. Although this remains a common way of referring to such texts, the term can carry negative associations. Thus it may be preferable to call such texts non-canonical, thereby simply distinguishing them from the 4 Gospels that formed part of the canon of the New Testament at a later stage in history. It must be remembered that the distinction between canonical and non-canonical texts is anachronistic, in that it did not apply at the time when the texts were written. Such a separation was possible only a few centuries later, when a fixed list of New Testament texts began to emerge. Although recognizing the limitations of terms such as apocryphal or non-canonical, both these labels will be used to refer to the range of Gospels under discussion. This approach recognizes the fact that this has become the common designation. But behind such shorthand labels, it needs to be seen that these are imposed modern categories that were not used by Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, when many of these texts were being produced or circulated. How many Gospels are there? Irenaeus not only provides the earliest certain usage of the term gospel to refer to written documents, he also gives the first extant reference to the existence of a fourfold gospel collection. While he asserts that there is only one gospel, i.e., the central message of Christianity, he also declares that it is known and received in a fourfold form, and he explicitly names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the authors of the 4 documents, Adversus Heresis 3:11:8. This may seem to settle the debate about the number of Gospels. However, it is well known that the writing of history is dominated by the perspectives of those who are victorious in battles over territory or ideas. Irenaeus's position anticipates what was to become the received orthodoxy of 4th century Christianity, yet even his complex arguments against competing views subvert his claim that it is self-evident that there can be no more or no fewer than 4 Gospels. In the process of refuting the followers of Valentinus, Irenaeus accuses them of possessing more Gospels than there really are, Adversus Heresis 3:11:9. He goes on to name one such document, the Gospel of Truth, but argues that this is so discrepant from the 4 received Gospels that it should not be classed in the same way. Despite his protestations, this argument vividly betrays the fact that for other Christians in the 2nd century there were indeed other Gospels than the 4 sanctioned by Irenaeus. For those who read such alternative writings, these documents were not of a lesser standing, but could be read as authoritative texts disclosing divine revelation. Other early church figures reveal knowledge of documents bearing the title Gospel, which do not belong to the corpus of the fourfold Gospel. For instance, the 4th century church historian Eusebius of Caesarea recounts the story of Serapion, bishop of Antioch, visiting the town of Rossus in his diocese. While there, he became acquainted with a document known as the Gospel of Peter. Initially, he stated no objection to this gospel being read alongside the 4 received Gospels. However, on his return to Antioch, advisors instructed him that some form of this text was used by a group known as the Docetics, deemed to be heretics. Consequently, Serapion wrote to the church in Rossis, rescinding his earlier permission to use this text. Eusebius, Historia Ecclesiastica, 6:12, 1-6. In addition to numerous examples of early Christian writers mentioning the names of texts containing the word gospel in the title, there are also manuscripts of non-canonical gospels that occur with titles bearing the term gospel. It is difficult to enumerate how many texts, disputed or otherwise, might be described as gospels, since some are categorized because of their form, rather than an explicit title, but recent attempts would perhaps list around 40 distinct ancient texts in this category. Unless a restrictive canonical approach is adopted that allows only the fourfold collection to be labeled as gospels, there is obviously a greater number of texts that potentially could be included in this category. The problem arises in deciding what to include or exclude. Upon reading the text, it is perhaps possible to sympathize with Irenaeus's refutation of the gospel of truth as being a gospel, on the likely assumption that the text of the same title discovered at Nag Hammadi is the document to which Irenaeus refers. Then it must be admitted that it does not read like one of the familiar 4 canonical texts. However, this text, like the Gospel of Mark, uses the term gospel in its opening phrase, and this is no doubt intended as an important clue as to how its contents are to be understood. Presumably, such a designation was not problematic for those early Christians who read it. On the other hand, there are texts that, in the form in which they survive, do not bear the word gospel in their title, such as the infancy account attributed to Thomas, or the Gospel of Peter, although Christian writers refer to texts known by these titles, but nonetheless, they do convey traditions and teachings of Jesus. Perhaps the best strategy is to investigate various texts as gospel-type writings. These writings would include texts that designate themselves as gospels, either through a title or description of contents. The selection also includes untitled writings that may be identified with titles of gospel writings, known by early Christian writers. An example would be the Gospel of Peter. Furthermore, it is helpful to consider those writings, such as the Protevangelium of James, which has been labeled as a gospel by scholarly convention rather than ancient attribution. Admittedly, this may cast a very wide net, and the grouping is functional rather than strictly defined, but the benefit in at least considering such a wide range of potential gospel texts is that it enriches the understanding of the diversity of this category in early Christianity and beyond, and seeks to ensure that texts are not excluded on the basis of preconceived theological boundaries. It is therefore necessary to be aware of different types of gospel texts that circulated in the ancient world. As different texts are discussed here, some of these gospels will be seen to be narrative accounts, others will catalogue sayings of Jesus, while still other texts concern not the adult ministry of Jesus, but his childhood, or even his mother's birth. At the other end of the chronological spectrum, a number of gospel texts purportedly record discourses that occurred after the resurrection, with figures privileged to receive such revelatory instruction. Gnosticism, misnomer or helpful category. Many of the alternative gospels that have come to light in recent manuscript finds, or those documents named as gospels by early Christian writers, were labeled either descriptively or pejoratively as Gnostic. One trend in recent scholarship has been to question the utility of this term, arguing that it is both too broad and also repeatedly misused. It has been suggested that such labeling is not only unhelpful, but actually misleading. Consequently, the total abandonment of the term has been advocated. While some of the criticisms leveled against the use of this term are warranted, especially the labeling of any text with a mystic or cosmological interest as being pre- or proto-Gnostic, to abandon the term altogether seems akin to throwing out the proverbial baby with the bathwater, and in the process losing a helpful, heuristic tool that is of value if correctly understood. Part of the critique against using the term Gnosticism is that it does not create a useful taxonomy for categorizing the variety of religious movements of the 2nd century that are often grouped under this umbrella. Furthermore, it has been stated that the label Gnosticism is a modern construct unknown to the ancients, and that there was no such thing as a coherent Gnostic religion in the 2nd century. It is indeed true that there was no unified Gnostic religion in this period. Then again, neither was there any monolithic or clearly defined and governed Christianity, especially in the first half of the 2nd century. Despite what later secession lists suggest, there was no papal figure occupying episcopal office in Rome. Instead, Christianity, even in the imperial capital, was at best a loose confederacy of house churches for much of the 2nd century, and at worst, it was a collection of competing groups disputing the way to express their devotion to the Christ figure. In response to such observations, those who reject the category of Gnosticism would tend to argue that, by contrast, Christianity was not only a self-designation in the contemporary Greek vocabulary of the early centuries of the movement, but that it represents a phenomenon that has had a continuous existence since then, whereas Gnosticism seems to have disappeared by the end of the 5th century and is not spoken of again until the post-Enlightenment period. In this regard, it may be comparable to the use of the term charismatic to describe the religion of various groups that have widely divergent practices, but nonetheless share a belief that ecstatic spirit-led experiences distinguish them from the wider category of Christians. Similarly, Gnosticism, as used here, does not refer to a fully thought-out belief system, or to a coherent and well-developed religion. Rather, it is intended as a useful shorthand way of denoting a collection of groups with some highly significant differences, but unified by some strikingly similar features. Although there is a debate as to whether Gnostic thought predates Christianity, without offering any judgment on that issue, here the term will be used to refer only to those texts that attempt a synthesis of developed cosmology with some form of the Jesus tradition. First, these groups understand the created realm to have been brought into existence by a demiurge, a mediator figure who is below the all-high and fully spiritual God. This device preserves the taint of the material realm from contaminating the spiritual sphere. Consequently, the demiurge is an intermediary to whom the responsibility for the creation of the earth can be ascribed, and this in turn protects the supreme divinity of the spiritual realm from contact with what is conceived as being the defiling physical sphere. Second, there is a sustained interest in rites of ascent that allowed initiates to return to the higher spiritual realm. Third, those who adhered to such ideas should not be seen as a well-formed and hermetically discrete entity removed from wider Christianity. Instead, the devotees of Gnosticism are probably best thought of as being elitist, early Christians who coexisted alongside proto-Orthodox Christians but claimed superior insight into the mythological and deeper spiritual reality of the Christ Redeemer figure. There is also diversity within the wider category of Gnosticism, which can be clarified by a range of subcategories. Taking its name from its supposed foundational figure, Valentinus, Valentinian Gnosticism had perhaps the least developed cosmology and deviated least from emergent orthodoxy. Nonetheless, its divergences are striking. It advocated a belief in various eons, or emanations from God. The first series consisted of 30 eons, or 15 complementary male and female pairs. People were seen as being comprised of both a spiritual female angelic part and a material male human part. The reunion of the fractured being could only be achieved through participation in Valentinian rituals and ascent through the realms of the various eons. A key text for understanding the wider theological perspective of Valentinianism is the Gospel of Truth, to be discussed in the next chapter. Valentinus, the person with whom the origin of the Valentinian thought system is linked, remains a shadowy and elusive figure to modern inquirers. The little that can be patched together of his life suggests that Valentinus was an influential and respected intellect.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?